Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Isaso Dominguez de la Zabal, and I'm a policy advisor for EDRI, European Digital Rights, a network of more than 50 digital rights organizations, experts, and academics throughout the whole of Europe, not just the European Union. And we were asked to organize the Civil Society Agora for this EDPS 20th anniversary event. And we were really happy about that because we believe that civil society should always have a voice when it comes to data protection and anything that has to do with digital rights and the harms that are caused by technology and throughout the online realm. We were given complete freedom to organize this to organize this Agora, and this was even more of an excellent news for us because we wanted to have civil society that actually, contributes to the data protection spaces beyond GDPR in and of itself. We listened to the EDPS this morning saying that this doesn't have to do just with GDPR. It has to do with the data protection space and how we define and how we should, or maybe we need to reflect about redefine data protection. And actually, I'm going to take something that I heard at the Academic Agora organized by Gloria this morning. We need to review the theory of harms through collective perspectives, and I think that's what I wanted to do. When discussing what EDRI wanted to do with this Civil Society Agora with my brilliant colleague Chloe, the instant thought that came to mind is that every time we speak about data protection, and this is something that was also mentioned at the Academic Agora, there's too much emphasis on the individual perspective of that. At the maximum that we can get is that sometimes we speak about the harms that society perceived as a whole, but we never focus on the collective. Collective harms can be defined differently, and we might discuss that during this afternoon. But the idea is to free ourselves from the constraints of the current models and existing debates around data policy, data regulation, and data governance, and try to understand how different kinds of collectives define differently and mostly and notably defined by themselves, are also exposed to harms, what we are going to call, or what I like to call, data-driven harms caused by the digital ecosystem that nowadays is characterized by being, because it is data-intensive or data exploitative. And for that, I wanted to have brilliant civil society and academic/civil society representatives, because we need to understand what these collective harms are and how they are likely to inflict harm on specific communities, but also how this community-specific interpretation of these harms work and how we can also fight against these data-driven harms, collective data-driven harms. So without further ado, because you're not here to listen to me, I'm going to present to you my 5 brilliant panelists. Sarah, I had longer bios, but I think I'm going to try to shorten them because we only have an hour. So Sarah is the director and co-founder of Equinox Initiative for Racial Justice, a queer racialized-led advocating for a shift in laws and policies towards societies of care and not control and surveillance. Claire Godfrey is the executive director of the anti-monopoly organization, the Balanced Economic Project. Dionysia Pepa works as a senior policy at SMEX, which is a MENA digital rights organization based in Lebanon, or she is not based in Lebanon. And Anastasia Karagiani is a doctoral student at the LSTS research group of the Law and Criminology faculty of Université Libre of Brussels, and also a co-founder of Datavo, a civil society organization based in Greece for the advocacy of gender equality in the digital era. And James Farrar is the founder and director of Worker Info Exchange. And that's it. So I have prepared a first round of questions for the panelists, and afterwards maybe we could get to a second round of collective questions, but I would also want to invite the audience from this moment on to start reflecting about the questions they want to address to these brilliant panelists, so that we can start a kickoff, a really, really important and necessary discussion that shouldn't stop at the end of this panel. So first, Sarah. I forgot to say your surname. Sorry, I just said the surname on the other, Shachandra. So first, I would like you to expand, to elaborate on the concept of collective harms, because I've used this concept already 3 or 4 times, but maybe it would be interesting for the audience to understand what this idea of collective harm means. Also, whether during all of your years of experience, whether you have also, what are the main data-driven harms that you have identified in your work, and maybe if the EU regulation, if the EU data protection space or legal framework can protect or has been able to protect these vulnerable communities. And what is the role, I also wanted to ask something, what is the role of AI? Maybe that's going too far. But what could be the role of AI in intensifying and strengthening these data-driven harms that are even more painful or harmful with collectives? And last but not least, but I'm not sure you're going to have time, it's important for us to understand that when we speak about those who are doing harm, we instantly think of technological companies, but also states. The states are also controllers, according to the GDPR, and are also causing a considerable amount of harm to collectives. So maybe, particularly when it comes to migration, because this is a field that you have worked with, so if you could also try to reflect on that, that would be great.
So I will do my best on all of that, and thank you, Ichaso, and thanks to you all for coming. I heard that we were competing with a coffee break, so thanks for coming in. My name is Sarah, again, as Ichaso said. I'm not only the co-founder of Equinox Initiative for Racial Justice, but alongside a number of colleagues of the room, worked on the advocacy of the EU Artificial Intelligence Act, and I'm one of the coordinators of something called the Protect Not Surveil Coalition, which looks at this exact issue of collective harm, specifically with the focus on the impact of technological harms, data-driven harms on migrants and people on the move. So my comments and my attempts to answer these questions will really come in this concept. So the first question, what do we consider collective harm, and why is that concept important in the concept of looking at data protection, look at data-driven harms from the perspective of racialized communities? First and foremost, racialized communities always have addressed the concept of harm collectively as opposed to individually, because the very nature of racism is a collective concept. We bear the brunt of racism, which by nature groups people by race, by association with criminality, by various group features, group belonging. And therefore, we need a concept of collective harm to understand the racialized nature of data-driven harms, because that is the very nature of racism: grouping people, assumptions, stereotypes, collectivity in a negative sense. When we're looking at the impact of data-driven harms, and our group AI, along with that, to put 2 questions in one there, what we see is that AI systems, data-driven harms, they sit on the top of a shelf of what are broader systems of oppression. I'll focus my interventions on uses of data, uses of AI in the migration context, but also in the policing context. Here we see how AI systems, the processing of personal data, but also not only the processing of personal data, produces a form of collectivity in the harm that they produce. By nature, they supercharge these harms by producing predictions, by creating assumptions about large groups of people, by generating decisions about people in major areas of life. When I first started working in the data protection area, a lot of the conversations that were coming up were around consumer data, really important issues about how large technology companies use our data that we provide as consumers of large tech products. This is a huge issue, and it's an issue of corporate abuse of our data. But what we were seeing is that a broader issue was coming up in terms of how states use our data, how states perpetrate harm. in the context of surveillance. So when we're looking at AI in the use of policing or in the use of migration control, we're seeing across Europe more and more examples of the use of AI systems to increasingly surveil people in the public space, which is an issue of mass surveillance, but also in targeted ways. So when we're talking about the use of biometric surveillance, why have there been more and more examples of the targeted use of those systems in racialized communities? When we're looking at the use of AI in the welfare context, many of the examples and many of the bases of the challenges of them were not just on the violations of personal data, using personal data that shouldn't have been used to assess welfare, but also disproportionately impacting people with a migrant background, single mothers, people of color. In the migration context, we've seen a number of use cases of AI to surveil people disproportionately, to criminalize migrants, but also not just to treat people as individuals, but as a block of people that we should be suspicious of, are criminalized because of their race, and that we need to use data as an aggregate to prevent their movement. When we were lobbying on the AI Act, we looked into the different types of use cases of AI that were being used in the migration context. Some of the big headlines were around the use of AI lie detectors to assess people's individual visa claims, etc. But there was another more insidious use case, which was the use of predictive analytics to forecast migration trends. So forecasting where illegal migration is happening, where it is not, so that policing, so that immigration control could be redirected to those areas, redirected to those border areas. There is a political underpinning for this. This is not just an issue of personal data. Often it is not personal data that is being used in these contexts. It's location data, it's aggregated data that doesn't use any sensitive data of individuals. However, the harm is very real. When predictive analytics systems are used to reinforce the redirection of immigration controls in order to prevent people from entering Europe or to push back people after they have already entered Europe, this is what we are seeing when we look at the news and we see the Greek coast guard putting babies onto ships and then abandoning them at sea. These are some of the things that we talk about when we talk about collective harm. They don't necessarily, they can, but they don't necessarily rely on the issue of personal data processing. And therefore, when we lobbied on the AI Act, we really thought we need to interrogate what these harms are. The harms that we're talking about when we're talking about the use of AI in areas like policing, in areas like migration, they touch on data protection, and sometimes they're increased by violations of data protection. But they are not only those harms. These harms include violations of the right to asylum. They include racial profiling. They include a really wide set of harms that touch individuals and collectives and are much broader than the concept of data protection can even sometimes hold. So we'll talk a little bit about how does the principle of data protection really help us, and why we think maybe it can in certain instances. We've used data protection as a tool to challenge many of these harmful use cases. But in many cases, the concept doesn't hold and it doesn't help us in those concepts. And those are for two main reasons. Ichaso mentioned the individual nature of the data protection framework, relying on individual cases of processing of personal data or processing of violations at the individual level. Many of these use cases, and the very nature of AI being used, is to be more efficient at surveilling us, more efficient at making decisions, more efficient at implementing austerity measures. And therefore, by nature, in many ways, the data protection framework didn't help us because it was not necessarily individual harm which was at the root of using those systems. It was something much broader. The second issue is the reactive nature. While data protection did help in some of the first challenges to Siri in the Netherlands, to the use of AI in welfare, it helped and it was a basis of those challenges, but it was not, it required the harm to happen first. I'll talk a little bit in the second round of the question about why the concept of reactivity is not necessarily the same issue of preventativeness, but a number of reasons why we tried in the AI Act advocacy to address some of these collective harms in a non-individualistic and non-reactive way is because we cannot allow harm to happen first. We need systems and we need frameworks of harm that are preventative, forward-looking, and are not individualistic. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Rosara. That was brilliant. When thinking about whom to invite to the session, of course, and when thinking about what collectives are affected by these, what we are calling data-driven harms, we first thought about all of those who have already been impacted by power asymmetries throughout centuries, not just decades and years. And this is why, for example, racialized communities came to mind. But there's also a number of collectives that are quite recent when it comes to defining these collective data-driven harms, right? And this is why I thought about inviting GEMS. So, because when we platform workers, they came up in the academic agora, but this is not something that instantly comes to mind when people think about data collective harms caused by data-intensive technologies. So I have the same question for you, which are those data-driven harms? Have you found that the existing data protection space, regulation, or community is able, or even the framework in and of itself, allows you to actually address these harms? And because your organization is also wonderfully organized initiatives of strategic litigation, and when we also said that we are going to discuss what are these collective harms, but also what can we do, as Sarah was already started to discuss, what can we do in order to prevent those harms. At the end of the day, it's about how we are going to protect these collectives. What are the advantages of all, but also the drawbacks of this kind of collective action, which is strategic litigation? Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Tasso, and thank you for inviting me here and to be part of this panel. It's an honour, and of course I learn a lot from these experiences as well, so I appreciate being here. Yes, of course, workers, trade unions are the most common collective that we've had, and maybe the most durable that we've had for over 100 years. But one of the risks, I think, as we digitise work, is that we almost go back to square one. We took some litigation in the Netherlands against Ola Cabs and Uber, and interestingly, one of the arguments that Ola Cabs made against Worker Info Exchange having the right to represent workers in the way we did in that litigation is that it was an interference in competition. And this brings us back to 100 years ago, because 100 years ago trade unions were considered criminal cartel organisations. And still today in the TULCRA, the trade union legislation in Britain, there's a waiver for restraint of trade is written into the legislation. Well, that's the history of how workers were treated 100 years ago. And yet here we were in 2023, and the same arguments were being trotted out in court under the guise of some kind of digital progress at work, that these rights were not, how dare we ask for these rights. So luckily the court agreed with us that not only was it not an abuse of rights to collectivise in this way, it was actually the whole point of what the underlying principles of the European Charter was to strengthen the agency, strengthen the hand of workers, strengthen the collective hand of workers, which was really heartening to see. In terms of the collective harms, we've just, as we prepare for a general election in Britain at the moment, God help us, we prepared a little manifesto, and if you look at workerinfoexchange.org/manifesto, we've listed 10 points, and in there I think you can see some of the harms, if I don't get to them right now. But the number one thing really is this surveillance and algorithmic control at work. The game is misclassification to deny a relationship of employment, and employment is a relationship like any other. And can you imagine what it feels like to say, well, look, we're in a relationship, and the other party says, no, there's no relationship here. And the burden on you as a worker is to prove that there is a relationship. Now, how do you do that when the essence of that relationship is buried in algorithmic control that's concealed from you. And that's the work that we try to do at Worker Info Exchange, is to identify and expose that. And it's been a bit of a war of attrition, starting with making subject access requests, getting explanations of algorithmic function, logic of processing, and starting putting those pieces together. I mean, in terms of the surveillance, though, what harms is it doing? So some of the surveillance is things like facial recognition. That was something that was rushed out in the trade a couple of years ago to disastrous consequences. But of course it doesn't matter, because if the workers have no recourse, does it matter? Does it matter if this tool that you're using is only 80% effective and you dismiss or discard 20% of the workforce? Does that matter? Well, there's no consequence for the employer when they do that. And that's exactly what happened when facial recognition was rolled out. And of course it was the racialized workforce that suffered and lost not only their jobs, but their reputation. The intense emotional damage that's done to people when they're accused of some kind of identity fraud or financial fraud. And these, these allegations are generated by AI fraud detection technologies that are not properly tuned, are not accurate, and are used against the racialized workforce, marginalized workforce that have no rights. And of course, the goal in all of this too is to performance manage, to surveil and performance manage, and to conceal that. There's also a role here of the state, security services in particular. What we found in London in particular was that, let's say in the United States, in the transparency report published by Uber, was 5,000 requests from law enforcement for all of North America. And in London in 1 year, just from the Metropolitan Police, there was 2,500. That's the level of scale of unwarranted requests without warrant that were being made and furnished by the platform. For what purpose? We don't know. We've represented people who found that their license was denied because they were told that there was some police action against them for drugs. And when we traced it all back, the police, did say they had an investigation, couldn't find the notes, couldn't understand why this happened. It was all a big mistake. But this intelligence was shared. This information was shared across sectors, between the transport regulator, between the transport police and, narcotics police, whatever. The consequence was very severe for that one worker who wasn't informed of any of it until their license was denied, and then had to work backwards to find out what had gone on. So, I mean, in terms of the collective harms for workers, to be very specific, what we see a decade into the gig economy, into that platform now, growth has slowed. So they can't grow their way out of problems. A lot of these companies have exited out of VC into public companies. They need to generate a profit, or they need to convince their investors that they are on a path to profit someday. And so they're turning to new technologies that determine pay and work allocation dynamically, dynamic pricing, dynamic pay and pricing systems. And these are really problematic, very problematic for consumers, because it raises the specter of tacit collusion. If you've got competing apps setting prices, they don't drive themselves to zero. They actually game each other out and stop above equilibrium. So it's quite dangerous from a competition perspective. But imagine if they're doing the same on the other side of the wall in the labour market. What you've got effectively is you're gaming people to see how low they'll accept pay. But you're also effectively blacklisting and greylisting people, which is, again, brings us back to the bad old days of the labour movement. So pay and work allocation is a really important issue. The issue of robo-firing, being fired, being dismissed by machine. We had, in our case that we took to Amsterdam against Uber, the court determined that the workers were indeed dismissed without any meaningful human intervention. And it turns out that the people who were looking at it, whose review wasn't meaningful, they were not HR managers. They were financial risk managers. What they were looking at was financial risk fraud on their platform. That's what they were looking at. It wasn't the proper HR process. So those robo-firing, then this algorithmic control at work, understanding how and why you're being managed. And the game is to deny rights, to sidestep this relationship of employment, to deny that this relationship exists. And once you start down that road, not only can you really pressure people on pay, you can over-surveil them, you can dismiss them, but you can also misclassify them to avoid the employment relationship. And in doing that, the biggest problem at the heart of the gig economy is the failure to pay working time for all of the time working. So about 50% of working time is the waiting around. There's about 50% more people deployed in taxi and food delivery service than there is work to do, because they need that in order to have a very fast response time. They need that to, magic the online on-demand service into the real world and give you a service in real time. It's only possible by having an oversupply of labour, and it's only possible to do that if you don't pay them. And that has a big effect on workers, because not only are they underutilised for their time on the road, but they've invested in assets to do that work. Electric bikes are £1,000. An electric vehicle is going to be £40,000. You need a return on those things. But it's also weakened your bargaining power. So you can only have flexibility in work if it really doesn't matter whether you show up at all or not. Yeah, sure. Work when and where you want. The flip side of that is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you don't show up, and don't expect us to pay you much for it either. So the bargaining power is reduced. And then finally, I would just say, in terms of trade union rights, there's one thing about the problem of translating the rights that we do have into the new digital world, but it's the next thing is to evolve those rights. So, for example, in Britain, we still don't have the right to take electronic ballots. Well, can you imagine in a digital world where you've got digital workers, you can't run an electronic ballot? Of course we have to run electronic ballots. That is the most appropriate way to organise workers in that type of digital world. So we need to transform. We not only need to get people into protection, but we need to transform the protections that people are needed for the challenges of a new digital workplace. Shall I carry on, or will I stop?
No. I think we can speak about strategic litigation afterwards if you have time. Thanks so much. That was brilliant. You spoke about how one of the factors for why, you didn't say that, but I interpreted that as such, how data invasive technologies are becoming more and more harmful, also because of the pressure that the investors exert, right? Asking for more profit. So that leads me to one of the other main characteristics, features of the current digital ecosystem, which is that it is disempowering when it comes to collectives, when it comes to groups and individuals being unable to exert any kind of control about how their data, not just their personal data, thanks so much, Sarah, is being, generated, obtained, and processed and used against them sometimes, but also about how it is completely exploitative, right? When it comes to data practices, but also when it comes to the business model, right? And that leads me to Claire and her wonderful work about something that hasn't been mentioned since we started this wonderful event, which is the business model that is also inherently against data protection.
Great, thank you. And I'd also like to say it's great to be on this panel, and great to add the anti-monopoly dimension to not only this group, but also to have it in this this summit more widely. I'd like to say, as an anti-monopoly organisation more broadly, we work on all monopolies, although there is obviously a focus on big tech, but we do not work directly on data protection policy, and I have no particular expertise, legal policy or practice on this. Nevertheless, data is extremely relevant to the work of the Balanced Economies mission. Because our mission is, in being an anti-monopoly organisation, our mission is in essence about democracy. And we work collectively to reclaim the ability of present and future generations to collectively structure and restructure our economies. That's our mission, to always have that ability, bearing in mind that space is being closed, that democratic space is being closed down. So data sovereignty is central to the business models and therefore the monopoly power of big tech firms and other monopoly firms, and therefore it's, as I said, a central issue for anti-monopoly organisations. So to the first question, what are the main data-related harms that we have in our work? Well, we've heard they're manifold, and I'm sure we're scratching the surface here. I'm going to concentrate some of my comments on the functioning of democracy. I just wanted to put a few stats out there on the scale of dominance of the big tech firms. So Google holds 90% market share in online search globally. 99% of the world's operating system market share is split between Google, Android and Apple's iOS. Up to 90% of online shoppers use Amazon in many countries, and OpenAI GPT-4 model is housed on Microsoft's Azure cloud infrastructure. So that demonstrates the level of dominance over data that a handful of billionaire-owned firms have, and their unprecedented power, should I say US-based billionaire-owned firms, where their economic dominance now transcends markets and reaching into politics, and therefore poses a threat on democracy with that level of concentrated power. So I'm not going to spend too much on the specific harms from this, because colleagues on the panel have done that far more expertly than I have. Just to run through near total surveillance, curating algorithms, amplifying hate and harmful content, all to extract profits and consolidate power. Let's not overlook the fact that that's the driving force behind this constant consolidation of wealth begets power begets wealth. It's the profit motive, and that constantly shifting norms around personal privacy. Always those protections that we've established over many years are always being challenged. Preys on discrimination, as we said, and drives inequalities in all aspects, wealth and power inequality, but racial, social, any other inequality. And it also undermines our ability to increasingly to form and express independent thought, the way we communicate with each other, and how we organise around, as campaigning organisations, for example, around shared projects to promote the public good. But perhaps I think one of the most, despite that, as if all of that wasn't bad enough, these two big firms have secured a data hegemony over the most important resource for governance decision making. So this is the influence of big tech's power within governmental decision making is so entrenched that technology, big tech technology leads and determines government decision making, and this goes beyond government lobby and institutional capture. So onto the Second question, is data regulation limiting the power of big tech? Evidently not. So I'm sure that the policy on privacy and data is very strong. Probably good tools exist, and I imagine enforcement is weak. However, I'm not sure that great policy and even stronger enforcement is going to tackle these structural and systemic problems that we have without tackling directly monopoly power. And this means using competition policy. And we at the Balanced Economy Project think it's time to start talking about breaking up or breaking open these firms. Which is, over recent years, has become a bit of a taboo subject. And I'm sure there are pros and cons, which it'd be great to hear about. But we think that we should reclaim data as a public good. So can a collective approach to data contribute to more egalitarian societies? Yes. Look at data in the context of moving key infrastructural layers to the public sphere and commons. Digital public infrastructures, for example, is a form of breaking up or breaking open. Of course, this depends essentially on publicly accountable and transparent and inclusive governance structures, should I say. And it also means governments stepping up and leading directing policy in the public interest and not leaving it to the rentier-captured market.
Thanks so much. And let's not forget that actually the title of this event is Rethinking Data in a Democratic Society. So, in order to have genuinely democratic societies, we need to reclaim the data in order also to prevent these harms that are done, that are caused both to collectives and to the society, as a whole. And from the EU to the so-called MENA region, Middle East and North of Africa, we thought it could also be interested because actually all this mega obsessive individualistic approach, also consumer-centric approach that you mentioned, Sarah, of data protection is mainly European focused. How we have developed also the idea of universal and very much individual human rights. And we thought it could also be interesting to see how this collective approach to data protection or human rights as a whole could operate in another region, and the Middle East and North of Africa is our neighbor region. So I also have similar questions to you. So what are the main data-driven harms that you have identified in your work in SMEX, and how does data protection, if at all, operate in the Middle East? And something that we discussed during the prep call, and that was I was also very interested in, is all of these humanitarian European or mainly organizations coming from the global north, when they operate in the Middle East and North of Africa, how do they confront data protection when it comes to saving all of these collectives? And also, last but not least, what does a collective approach to data protection, a different culture of data protection, can teach us when it comes to the Middle East and North of Africa as Europeans? Thanks so much.
Thank you. I would like to address all three questions. Thanks Adri and the EDPS for the invitation, and that allows us to bring in the perspective from, we prefer to call it one region, West Asia and Northern Africa. It is a bleak, spoiler alert, perspective, unfortunately. And although the event is more, it's mainly EU focused, we cannot deny the existence of what we call the Brussels effect. So although legislation is produced internally for internal consumption, it has effects in other parts of the world, and the Iguana region is one of them. So recently we've seen the adoption of certain legislations for data protection in countries like Saudi Arabia, Oman, and in Jordan last year, which used the GDPR as the example. However, the region has a long tradition in authoritarian regimes, and even though these legislations may seem encouraging, and we may start to be optimistic about regulating the protection of personal data, their implementation, their enforcement is a completely different thing. And we have several examples of bad faith when it comes to the protection of personal data. We'll give you a few just to give you an idea. First of all, the first example comes from the World Cup in Qatar. So back in 2022, in order to gain entrance to the state of Qatar, but also to the stadiums, and you had to download an app called Haya app, where you had to upload a lot of your personal information, full name, date of birth, address, phone number, etc. And this was a technology that you couldn't opt out, because otherwise you wouldn't be granted access. And it's still used today. If you want to go to Qatar or attend any events like the aquatic event that is hosted in August this year, you have to have this app, and this is your ticket, let's say. But if you go to their page and try to find their privacy policy, you will be quite disappointed because they don't uphold the standards from the European Union. There is no information about how long they're gonna store your data for, if they're gonna delete it ever, what are they going to do with it, if they're gonna use it for advertising purposes, etc. Another example of data-driven harms has to do with weak data security infrastructure. And I have plenty of examples from Lebanon this time. So first one has to do with data leaks. Back in 2015, there was an app called Cars 961, where you could upload the number plate of a car, and you could have access to all information pertaining to the driver of the car, the owner, sorry, not the driver. Full address, full name, date of birth, place of birth, etc. Another incident that comes from Lebanon was the data leak of a list of voters. So in the last elections, there was, not in the last elections because this hasn't taken in a while, but the Lebanese embassies in The Hague and in the UAE received a list with the details that have on voters of all Lebanese expats, and this was directly forwarded to all people, all the members of the list. So to make it a bit clearer, you are a Lebanese residing in The Hague. You have given your details, your personal info to the embassy, and then you receive an email containing all the information about everybody else residing in The Hague. And this included not only the name and the state, the date of birth, etc. It included the religion, the marital status, and the sex and other sensitive data, personal data, sorry. Weak data infrastructure, security infrastructure also permits cyber attacks. A third example from Lebanon. In 2018, there was a hacking scandal. Krypton Security, a Lebanese-based hacking company founded in 2013, breached the security of major public institutions. And this included the civil flight data from Beirut International Airport, websites of the Ministries of Interior and Economy, the Civil Status Directorate at the Ministry of Interior, etc. So, unfortunately, I can go on with a lot of examples from data-driven harms from the region, and we can certain that people's rights are brutally violated. And it's not just their right to privacy and their protection of the personal data. This has several repercussions to other rights as well. For example, freedom of expression. For instance, members of the LGBTQ community cannot freely express themselves because they will be persecuted, and there are laws that criminalize their sexual orientation. I will move now to the next question about biometrics. So one question is, why do we use biometrics and we not just use personal data? It is because specific body patterns are proven unique and persistent over time, making biometric technology useful to humanitarian organizations. And it was back in 2010 that the UNHCR made biometrics an official policy. And ever since, other humanitarian organizations like the World Food Programme and Médecins Sans Frontières follow suit. And one of example of biometric use is the iris guard scanners. So basically, the aid beneficiaries go to the ATM, they have their irises scanned, and then the bank, which is supposed not to have access to this data, it just delivers a yes or no answer, depending on if they are identified as beneficiaries. This system is quite popular in many countries from the region, in Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan, in Egypt, etc. There are certainly some benefits to the use of biometric data. First of all, it helps prevent fraud and track multiple aid claims. It provides high level of assurance in beneficiary numbers and the allocated resources. It speeds up the registration of refugees and other aid beneficiaries. It shortens the waiting time at aid distribution points, and it facilitates the issuing of identity documents. However, the drawbacks are a lot, and they're very serious. First of all, given the fact that this happens in authoritarian regimes, the possibility of those regimes getting access to such data enables them to, again, persecute people and surveil the population. Sometimes they're hard to capture biometric traits. For example, if somebody's hand is burnt, the fingerprints are not that accurate to do the verification process or the identification process. There are some technical errors, and the system can fail to recognize targeted beneficiaries. The beneficiaries themselves lack information about why their data is collected, where it is stored, how long it is retained for, etc., how it's used. And this also is a problem when when humanitarian organizations have to partner with private companies. This poses new risks. For example, the aid beneficiaries represent future market opportunities for profit-oriented companies. And in the cases that the data is not collected directly by the humanitarian agencies, organizations, and it's through a third party, this can create a lot of problems. This was the case with Western Union that directly collected data to distribute cash assistance to people affected by the Typhoon Guni in the Philippines in 2020. So the guiding principle in this case should be the principle of minimization. The International Committee of the Red Cross has opted for this solution. They are trying to collect as few biometric data as possible. They're trying to opt for other solutions, like in Ukraine, they would do the identification through the national tax number or through passports. This is not always feasible in contexts where, for example, in Palestine, those identification documents are not available for the vast population. But the approach of less data, more protection is the one that we should look into and should be adopted in general by other humanitarian organizations, especially in the region where the risks are too high and the goal is helping people, not putting them in a more vulnerable situation that they're already in. And the last question was about the collective approach and the... yeah, okay. I will just make a brief comment on legislation. Sometimes we consider that legislation and regulation is the remedy. It's not in this occasion, unfortunately, because the precedent that we have from those countries is a bleak one. Although the recent laws that have been adopted, as I mentioned earlier, are based on the EU example. Cybercrime laws in Jordan and in Iraq that were passed last year, they have they use very broad terms. They criminalize anonymity, they criminalize the use of VPNs, so they're against, in essence, the protection of human rights in general, so we cannot be very optimistic that this time, miraculously enough, those countries, those states decided to uphold their human rights obligations and be compliant with what the global north expects them to do.
Thanks so much. I loved also how you touched onto how these collectives are, certain collectives, for example, vulnerable communities such as LGBTQIA+ communities are especially affected, impacted, not just, again, the data protection and the right to privacy, but also many other fundamental rights, right? Even the right to safety, which at the end of the day is also a fundamental right. Anastasia, last but not least, that's it, your role. So yeah, very similar questions about, what are the data-driven harms that you have identified. In this case, you focus mainly on feminist approaches to data protection. So when it comes to women, so then we go again, intersectionality. James also mentioned how racialized workers are the main impacted by these data-driven harms, but also I guess women, racialized and even workers can be even more impacted. Also LGBTQIA communities. And others like sex workers, because you also work with a wonderful EDRI member, which is EDRI. I know you're also a specialist on AI. We already heard a little bit about AI. I don't know if you have time about that. And something also to complement your last point, whether there's a potential social value to data, because we keep discussing how data-driven harms are really dangerous to collectives, but also to societies. But data can be good, right? Or can it?
Thank you so much for the invitation. Many thanks also to the organizers. I feel extremely honored to share the panel with great panelists today and have also the possibility to talk to you and share, of course, a part of my work. As you mentioned, my work focuses on tech-facilitated gender-based violence cases and gender discrimination in AI regulatory frameworks. A disclaimer from the first beginning that my background is in law, and so this means that I am going to share some legal insights. I will comment some pieces of legislation that touch upon the feminist issues and feminist approaches of data-driven harms. And of course, I am going also to share some cases, some parts of my activist work. So I will try somehow to combine these. To begin with, I need to highlight that according to the feminist theory of violence, the violence is viewed as a structural element, which means that, of course, it's not an individualistic thing. Violence is not perpetuated in a personal level, but there is a system behind that supports the violence. And of course, talking about digital technologies, one aspect of this is how these digital technologies facilitate gender-based violence forms. For instance, I will provide you with some examples like cyberstalking, cyber harassment, the generation of non-consensual sexualized deepfakes, like the generation of image-based abuse with the use of AI software. Another form of violence, of course, is sexist hate speech, cyber flashing, which belongs to online harassment, cyber harassment, cyberbullying, doxing, and I can list so many examples, unfortunately. All of these forms of violence have a detrimental impact, have a harmful impact on the psychological situation of the survivor. Of course, they have a societal harm, they have a financial harm on the survivors. For instance, like psychological harm is the trauma that is caused by these instances, the fact that all the survivors feel that they are humiliated, they are afraid that this is going to last forever, because unfortunately we know that whenever, when something is uploaded online in the online world, we cannot track it, so we cannot somehow control that, and we cannot stop the harm. We cannot stop the link, this illegal linking. Survivors have also shared that they feel that they are exposed, they feel disrespectful, and they feel that they are traumatized. And I would like to highlight this because I do believe that this is not considered very carefully and very seriously into account from their legislators, because, for instance, quite recently, the last years, the cases of image-based sexual abuse was addressed under the general data protection regulation, like it was considered as a form of data breach, the violation of data protection. However, this trauma is missing from that, because it's not about the fact that there was solely a violation of data, like a violation of the image that was illegally shared. There is something beyond that. Of course, regarding the societal harms, I need to stress the victimization that unfortunately takes place after these instances. We know that there is a secondary victimization when the survivors go to report these cases in law enforcement agencies, but the secondary victimization also takes place online, like for instance when the survivors share their experiences and they share it with making a post on social media. The comments that they received, first of all, they are not believed. They have to prove that actually they have the burden of proof, that they need to prove that actually these cases, these instances took place. And of course, there is a replication of sexist hate speech and stigma about female sexual liberation, I will try to make it very brief. But of course, there is also a financial impact of this violence, because unfortunately many survivors were fired, for instance. And of course, all these stereotypes are somehow replicated in this rhizomatic, algorithmic design of these technologies. With rhizomatic is a new concept that I came across some weeks ago, and refers to the learning process that is very complex, and that every learner brings their own context. And we know that when these technologies are designed, the bias are replicated also in the designment process, because the stereotypes have a deep root in the society. And of course, for instance, when we design these technologies, the beauty filters that are used on social media, on TikTok, on Meta, quite recently, I have written a paper, co-authored a paper, and in this paper, we addressed the issue of augmented reality beauty filters and the beauty standards that are replicated on TikTok. And we found out that actually female users were disproportionately impacted of these beauty filters. They were discriminated because, of course, there were all these beauty standards that need the female users to wear a lipstick, to look beautiful, to smile a lot, etc., etc. So this means that there are some invisible harms. There are some invisible parts of violence that we need somehow to address them. We need to look at them, and we need to acknowledge that they exist. And in this way, for instance, when we don't look, when we don't shed light on these invisible harms, we normalize these forms of violence because we think that this is very normal, like wearing a lipstick is very normal for femininity, for a woman. Why this should not be normal, like for a female user? To this extent, I think that the collective approach is needed in order, like, to denormalize gender-based violence that is facilitated by digital technologies. And of course, like, we need to somehow reclaim our space in this digital era. And of course, like, we can do so by reclaiming somehow our power to this extent, I believe that we can do so by looking at the social value of data. Quite recently, I read a book that is titled Counting Feminicides. And is authored by Catherine Ignacio and Lauren Klein, I'm not sure. So, yeah, like, I was thinking, like, oh my God, I was reflecting while I was reading the book, this book, that yes, like, the data that are stored are the data that are needed from these digital monopolies that have a profit for them, but there are so many data in the society that we need to look at them, and we need them in order to address some issues. For instance, like, unfortunately, feminicides happen every hour, every second, everywhere around the world, like, it's a global phenomenon. And where are these data? Because quite recently, like, I'm coming from Greece, and when we try to raise the awareness on feminicide, some of the people look at us and ask us, like, okay, why do we need the term feminicide in the Greek criminal legislation? It's just a homicide, like, why we need the term feminicide? And then we need data to prove why, and to like, somehow support our argument why we need feminicides. Why this? Because this happens, and we need this data. And last but not least, I'm trying to address all these issues. Yeah, I would like to provide some brief comments on the AI Act. 1 second. Thank you. I do believe that sometimes in these cases that I described to you, we don't know that we interact with this technology. For instance, like, we don't know that a sexualized deepfake was generated. We will find it out quite later. So we need somehow to address that under transparency, explainability, and also, of course, like, through collective rights that are somehow addressed under Article 9 of the AI Act, but it's up to the member states to regulate on that. I will stop, and I'm looking forward to your comments after the session, or, like, you can contact me. I am open for the discussion.
Yeah, maybe it's after the session. I don't know if you have time.
Yeah.
But just because I think we need a last round of questions, what can we do? Even if it's just 2 minutes each, what do you think we can do in order to start changing the data protection culture that we have, or even digital ecosystems, data-invasive data ecosystems as we know? Can we follow the same order? Sarah already hinted about something.
I can really briefly say what I think about how do we resist, how do we challenge this, how do we challenge this data protection-centric understanding of harm. First, we've already mentioned it, and I think this panel speaks to that. Like, we have to resist the universality of harm, which I think is central to data protection culture, but also digital rights more generally. The idea that there is some individual universal impacted person that experiences harm in a very homogeneous way is completely, like, fantastical, and actually really serves to undermine these very specific examples of harm that this panel has mentioned, and specifically, I believe, excludes use cases in the migration context. As we delineate this border between Europeans and non-European, we will specifically ignore the impact on migrants, on racialized people, if we don't address universality of harm. I think going beyond personal data protection, conception of harm is part of it also. Looking also at spatial injustice, I think, is a big important thing, with the examples of predictive policing, of predictive analytics, specific examples of how racialized communities experience harm. It's about the person, it's about the collective, but it's also about how spaces are policed, how we deploy resources to manage populations, but also manage our cities, manage our space. So that's another way I think we can reconceptualize harm in order to resist. I think the other thing is that we need to understand that the result of harm is not about individual instances of data processing, but is, as Claire mentioned, part of a broader tech infrastructure. The harms are not a byproduct of these tech infrastructures, they are the causes. So to the point mentioned earlier, biometric systems in humanitarian aspects, there's a lot of discourse about how those biometric systems don't work because people burn their hands or whatever examples. It's not that. That's an example of them not working. People burn their hands because of biometric data collection. These systems, these contexts of surveillance, these contexts of tech infrastructures produce harm. Harm is not the byproduct of them. Lastly, how do we move beyond sort of like the understanding of it in our resistance? I think legally, one thing that we really need to look towards is not just reactive approaches, but preventative approaches. One thing we looked at in the AI Act legally is to how can we implement prohibitions that prevent harm as opposed to wait for harm to happen and then put the burden on primarily marginalized communities to contest them. So that's one thing. For civil society, I think meaningful challenge and is also about refusal in other ways as well. So we mentioned tech infrastructures, their role in surveillance, their role in monopolies. I think we need to go beyond the paradigm of competition law as a way to challenge these things, but also what are other ways of resisting these tech infrastructures. Tech workers resisted the use of Microsoft Azure, its role in apartheid, Israel's apartheid on Palestine, and its role in the occupation. There are other ways, other non-legal ways we can resist these infrastructures of domination and of oppression. So I'll stop there.
James?
Oh God, I wish I had answers. Well, I think the first thing is to I feel like waiting for Godot, for the last 10 years to be involved in organising the gig economy, waiting for a solution from Brussels with the Platform Work Directive, or waiting for the British government to do something, and that's the mistake. I saw a very eloquent concession speech for an MEP who lost their seat in this last election, and she said, the thing is, electoral politics is the place you go to organise. And actually, the mistake is that electoral politics is the place to go for organising to die. And we look to things like, say, collective bargaining as a solution, but often it's a double-edged sword. Collective bargaining is sometimes a way to suppress, to contain a conflict that needs to happen. We look at the GDPR, but then we run into obstacles straight away when, our opposers say it's trade secrets. We can't tell you why you've been fired because it's a trade secret. I kid you not, that's what we've had. And so the answer, I think, is organising. I think it is activism. It is supporting people who are affected by it. There was somebody in one of the earlier sessions talked about the importance of migrants being at the table, and look at us, are we really representative of the workers that are deeply affected by these technologies? Do most workers even know what the GDPR is or what digital rights are and how to access them and how to use them? Or do their trade unions know that? We're still a long way away from that. But, we mustn't settle for what we're given. We must solve our problems in the workplace, and then we bring that solution to Parliament and say, enact that, not enact, don't ask us to accept what you've dreamt up. You need to deal with the problems we're having in the workplace and enact that later. Anyway, I'm not feeling very eloquent at the moment, but I hope that's kind of an answer, that we need to organise and solve our own problems and not wait for academics and lawyers and legislators to give us a square pin to put our round socket into. Thank you.
Perfect. I think Claire has to drop a sentence and leave.
Yeah, sorry, I've got to dash after this, but one thing I did want to say is that we should really think about dominant narratives. So much around structural power, generally speaking, but the acceptance of the unfair system and the power relationships with this whole setup is naturalised in discourse, and we accept it. And I think, what things that are relevant here are biggest companies are the most efficient. There is no alternative. This is what we're stuck with. And sometimes I don't think we problematise these assumptions and this discourse enough. And I think that we'd be a lot more empowered if we did that and started to have the imagination and freedom to think of alternatives. It's all right.
Dionysia, sorry.
Yeah, very briefly. For us in the region, relying on legislation is not much of an option, as we said. So it's mainly through the civil society that we can get organized on a regional level and on an international level with other partners. And raise awareness. Okay, we've said these vague terms a lot of times, but we really need to make people understand that this affects them, and the people should start demanding more transparency and accountability from the private sector. And this is a debate recently with social media accountability and how we're going to hold them accountable for what's been going on in the context of the war on Gaza, for example. And another example is that big companies like Google and Amazon are going to they have announced their intentions on of establishing data centers in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. This will have several repercussions on the protection of digital rights for a lot of reasons, basically because the geographical location of a data center matters because it falls within the jurisdiction of the state. So we need to really start making those big companies assuming the responsibility of abiding by international standards, by upholding their obligations that derive from the UNGPs on business and human rights, and respecting international human rights and international humanitarian law, especially in armed conflicts.
Thanks so much. Eunicia, Anastasia?
Yeah. I think the first step is to acknowledge the visible and invisible forms of violence and no longer to endure them. The second step is like an interdisciplinary approach, like we need to look also at other disciplines and look at other kinds of impact and how we can address them. The third step is like I would say a holistic approach. Like, for instance, probably GDPR do not provide the solutions on that, but probably there are other pieces of legislation that can provide, like to look at other legal avenues. Like, for instance, in sexualized, non-consensual sexualized deepfakes is other question if they can be considered as image digital forgery. So look at other avenues. And last but not least, to try somehow collectively to reconstructure the digital technologies, because one important aspect of addressing these issues is like to find the evidence. And in the majority of the image-based sexual abuse cases, it's very hard to find the evidence to prove that there was a damage. And last but not least, because this is an EDPS event, to me, we need to look beyond consent. Because we don't give our consent, and we know that still these harms exist and these instances take place. So consent, I think, is an old-fashioned term for us. Look at other things. So thank you.
Thanks so much. I know we've run out of time, 20 minutes ago, but if there's any question, I think you can address them to me or to any of the brilliant panelists, or if there's a very urgent need to ask a question? No? That's great. You have, okay. Can you?
Yeah, thank you so much, because this was so rich and with so many connections with the panel in the morning. I think we're not only trying to bridge individual rights with collective values, but we're doing something much more profound here, which is reconstructing the theories of rights and reconstructing the theories of harms as well. So it's not only about bridging individual rights and collective values. I think it's much beyond. This is a main work stream in Brazil and in Brazilian legal theory as well, like reconstructing from the point of view of diffuse rights and collective rights. And I'll play here the devil's advocate, trying to think, what are the strongest arguments against that? What are the main challenges for this kind of collective enterprise we're doing here? I know Anastasia mentioned a few of those obstacles, like how to find the evidence or the thresholds for concrete harms, which in the US court cases are extremely strong legal argument. But what else would you point as one of the main obstacles for this kind of enterprise? Is the morality of rights in terms of political philosophy? Is it the power of ideology of individual rights? Is it the burden of proof on concrete harms? What else would you mention as main obstacles? Thank you.
Yeah, I will say, I'm the moderator, but I will say it's also the current balance of power that we find when it comes to how power is distributed between the different communities, the different individuals, but also when it comes to also the digital ecosystem, right?
Very quickly, I think that one of the main obstacles that I have faced is that we need to acknowledge, we need to check if we are in the same page. Because, like, for instance, in the feminist field, there are many people who pretend that they have feminist values, but they don't have in practice. So I think that we need somehow to double check if we are in the same page, if we have the same goals, if we are somehow inspired by the same values and we want to implement them, like communication.
I think we are going to be kicked out, so and I don't want that to happen because this is a wonderful space. But thanks so much. This has been so enriching. And again, this is just the start of the conversation. I think we need to keep having this discussion, communication, as you say, resistance, active resistance, centering the voice and the conceptualizations of those collectives which are mainly impacted by these data-driven harms, and changing the law, but also changing the digital ecosystem and actually the ecosystem in which we live in as a whole, in Europe and globally, apparently, right? So thanks so much for coming. Don't hesitate to reach out to the panelists, and yeah.